I never believed in near-death experiences. I thought they were just hallucinations, the brain's last, desperate attempt to make sense of its own shutdown. That changed on June 17th. My name is Archie Winslow, and for 10 minutes and 15 seconds, I was clinically dead. What I experienced in those moments transformed everything I understood about guilt, forgiveness, and what waits for us beyond this life. It was supposed to be the start of our summer vacation. My wife Elizabeth had spent weeks planning our trip to the coast. My mother, Margaret, had joined us, her first vacation in years. Our son James was 8, old enough to remember this trip forever. And little Anna, our 10-month-old daughter, was experiencing her first family vacation. The morning was perfect, clear skies with just enough breeze to keep the heat at bay. I remember checking the rearview mirror and seeing my mother telling James a story in the back seat. Elizabeth sat beside me, Anna secure in her car seat behind us, drifting to sleep to the gentle motion of our SUV. We were laughing about something trivial. I can't even remember what now. Elizabeth had her hand on mine as I drove down Route 16, the coastal highway that winds along cliffs overlooking the ocean. "I think this is going to be our best vacation yet," Elizabeth said, squeezing my hand. I smiled at her. "I think you're right." Those were the last words we shared. I didn't see the truck coming around the bend. Later, I'd learned the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel after driving all night. He crossed the center line at 68 miles per hour. I had maybe 2 seconds to react, not nearly enough time. I remember the initial impact, the deafening crunch of metal, the explosion of airbags, the shattering glass. Then a strange floating sensation, like I was being lifted up through layers of water toward the surface. There was pain, immense pain, and then nothing. The pain vanished, replaced by a strange weightlessness. I found myself hovering above the scene. I could see our mangled SUV, crushed on the driver's side where the truck had T-boned us. Emergency vehicles were arriving, their lights flashing silently. There was no sound, only an overwhelming quiet. I watched paramedics working frantically around the wreckage. I saw them pull my physical body from the driver's seat. My chest wasn't moving. My face was covered in blood. They laid me on a stretcher and immediately started CPR. One paramedic placed defibrillator pads on my chest, while another inserted a breathing tube. "Clear." The paramedic pressed the button, and my body jerked unnaturally on the stretcher. They checked for a pulse, then tried again, and again. I didn't feel connected to that broken body below. I was somewhere else, somewhere between. Then I saw something that shattered my heart. They were removing Elizabeth from the passenger seat. Her beautiful face was peaceful, but I knew immediately she was gone. There was no movement in her chest, no response as they checked her vitals. They covered her with a white sheet. I tried to scream, to reach for her, but I had no voice, no physical form to move. Behind her seat was Anna's car seat, crushed beyond recognition. A female paramedic gently removed my daughter's tiny body. She cradled Anna briefly, her professional demeanor breaking for just a moment as she placed my baby girl next to her mother, covering them both. My mother had been sitting directly behind me. The impact had been most severe on our side of the vehicle. Like me, they were performing CPR on her, but I could somehow sense it was too late. The only one showing signs of life was James. He was unconscious but breathing as they carefully extracted him from the wreckage, stabilizing his neck and rushing him to an ambulance. I wanted to follow James, to somehow protect him, but I felt myself being pulled away. Grief and guilt overwhelmed me. I had been driving. I should have seen the truck sooner. I should have reacted faster. I should have protected them. "Elizabeth, Mom, Anna." I tried to call out, but my voice made no sound in this in-between place. The scene below began to fade as I was drawn backward, away from the accident, away from my family, into darkness. The darkness enveloped me completely. I was moving, or rather being moved, through what felt like a tunnel. There was no light ahead, only the sensation of traveling at immense speed through infinite blackness. The guilt crushed me more heavily than the truck had crushed our SUV. 3 generations of my family, gone in an instant, because I hadn't been vigilant enough. Then, suddenly, light. It didn't appear gradually. One moment there was darkness, the next, light surrounded me from all directions. It wasn't blinding despite its intensity. It was warm, comforting, almost tangible, like being immersed in liquid love. The light seemed to penetrate through me, washing away the physical pain I'd felt at impact, though the emotional agony remained. Within this light, I sensed presences. Then I saw them, Elizabeth and my mother, standing together, smiling at me. They looked as they had that morning, Elizabeth in her blue sundress, my mother in her favorite cardigan, but somehow more vibrant, more real than they'd ever been in life. There were no injuries, no blood, no signs of the trauma they'd just endured. They looked whole and at peace. Elizabeth? Mom? I tried to reach for them, but I still had no physical form to extend. Elizabeth's smile was gentle, understanding. Archie, she said, and her voice was clearer than I'd ever heard it. It's okay. It's not okay, I cried out, and this time my voice echoed around us. You're gone. Anna's gone. I was driving. I should have... No, son, my mother interrupted, her voice firm but kind, the way it had been when I was a child making a mistake. There was nothing you could have done. Nothing. But I was responsible for you all. I was driving. I should have seen it coming. Elizabeth moved closer to me. I couldn't feel her touch physically, but I felt her presence surround me with comfort. The other driver fell asleep, Archie. No one could have avoided what happened, not even you. But Anna, she was just a baby. She barely had a chance to live. The grief was overwhelming, crushing my spirit as thoroughly as the truck had crushed our vehicle. She's here with us, my mother said. She's perfect and whole. She knows only love now. Then I want to stay too, I declared. I want to be with you all. Elizabeth's expression changed to one of concern. You can't, Archie, it's not your time. Why not? Why them and not me? Why should I have to go back alone? Not alone, my mother said. James survived. He needs you. James, my son. The thought of him waking up in a hospital, learning his mother, sister, and grandmother were gone. I couldn't bear it. He'll have another family to care for him, I argued desperately. My brother, your sister, I said to Elizabeth. They'll love him like their own. But he needs his father, Elizabeth insisted. He needs you, Archie. I can't do it without you, I confessed, the truth of my inadequacy pouring out. I've never been the better parent. You were always the one who knew what to do, what to say. I'll fail him. You won't, Elizabeth said with absolute certainty. You're stronger than you know. The guilt, I whispered. How do I live with the guilt? Before either of them could answer, the light around us intensified. I sensed another presence, something vastly more powerful than anything I'd ever encountered. The light seemed to coalesce, taking shape before me. I couldn't make out distinct features, but I knew, with absolute certainty, who stood before me. In all my years of church attendance, all my prayers and Bible readings, I had tried to imagine what Jesus would look like, sound like, feel like. Nothing in my imagination had come close to this reality. His presence was overwhelming, an authority that should have terrified me, but instead made me feel completely known and completely loved simultaneously. When he spoke, it wasn't with a single voice, but seemed to resonate from everywhere and everything, including from within me. Archie. Just my name, spoken with such love that it broke something open inside me. I felt myself weeping, though I had no physical eyes to produce tears. Lord, I managed to say, overcome with unworthiness in his presence. You carry a burden that is not yours to bear, he said. But I was responsible for them, I insisted, even to him. I was driving, they were in my care. Do you believe I am sovereign over all things, Archie? That not a sparrow falls without my knowledge? The words echoed in my spirit. I had read them many times, believed them in theory, but now they were being asked directly of me by the author of those words. Yes, Lord, but there are no buts with me, Archie. If you believe I am sovereign, then you must accept that I permitted what happened today for reasons beyond your understanding. But why? I cried out. Why take them? Why not me instead? Why leave James without his mother? My ways are not your ways, Archie. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. More scripture, spoken with such authority that I couldn't question it, yet my heart still ached for answers. The driver who hit you, Jesus continued, he carries guilt as well. His name is Thomas. He has 3 children of his own. He fell asleep for less than 10 seconds. The revelation stunned me. I hadn't even thought about the other driver yet. My focus had been entirely on my own family, my own loss. He's asking me the same questions you are, Jesus said. Why did I let him fall asleep? Why didn't I wake him? Why must others suffer for his mistake? I felt a strange connection to this man Thomas, this stranger who had destroyed my family in an instant of unconsciousness. Will you tell him I forgive him? The words surprised me as they formed. Jesus' presence seemed to grow even warmer around me. You must tell him yourself, Archie, when you return. Return? But I don't want to return. The thought of going back to a world without Elizabeth, without my mother, without baby Anna, was unbearable. James needs his father, Jesus said simply. Show me, I whispered. Suddenly, the scene shifted. I was in a hospital room. James lay in a bed, his small body wrapped in casts and bandages. He was unconscious, but I could see his chest rising and falling with each breath. A doctor and nurse stood at his bedside talking in low voices. Brain activity is strong, the doctor was saying. Multiple fractures, but children are resilient. Physically, he should recover. And the rest of the family? The nurse asked. The doctor shook his head. The grandmother and mother were DOA, the baby girl as well. The father's still in trauma 1. They're trying to restart his heart. Poor kid, the nurse said, looking down at James. He'll wake up to find his whole world changed. He still has his father, the doctor said, if they can bring him back. And if they can't? The doctor didn't answer, just made a notation on James's chart and moved toward the door. I felt a hand on my shoulder, or the spiritual equivalent of one. It was Elizabeth. He needs you, Archie, she said again, more than he's ever needed you before. I don't know how to be both mother and father to him, I admitted. I don't know how to help him through this loss when I can barely imagine surviving it myself. You won't be alone, Jesus said, his presence returning us to the light. I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Another scripture, but this time it felt like a personal promise rather than a quotation. The guilt, I said again. How do I live with the guilt of surviving when they didn't? Do you believe I died for your sins, Archie? Yes, Lord. All of them? Yes. Then believe that I died for this guilt too, though it is not truly yours to bear. Will you reject my gift of forgiveness by clinging to guilt I've already paid for? Put that way, my guilt seemed almost prideful, as if my determination to blame myself somehow superseded Christ's authority to forgive. And Thomas? I asked. The other driver? My grace is sufficient for him as well, if he will accept it. Perhaps you will be the one to help him see that. The thought was staggering, that I might someday face the man responsible for my family's deaths and offer him forgiveness rather than condemnation. Your guilt serves no one, Archie, Jesus continued. Not Elizabeth, not your mother, not Anna, not James, and certainly not me. I did not die so that you could live condemned by guilt I've already paid for. His words penetrated deep into my spirit, beginning to loosen the grip of guilt that had seized me from the moment I saw the accident scene from above. Let it go, Elizabeth urged. For James, for yourself. And for us, my mother added. We're at peace, Archie. We need you to find peace too. Will I Will I see you again? I asked them. They both smiled, and I felt rather than saw Jesus smile as well. In the blink of an eye, Jesus said, "What seems long to you will pass quickly." And then eternity together. I looked at Elizabeth, memorizing her face, her smile, the love in her eyes. I looked at my mother, seeing in her the strength she'd always carried, now perfected in this place of light. "Anna?" I asked. "She's here," Elizabeth assured me. "She's perfect and whole and loved, and she'll be waiting for you too when it's truly your time." I felt myself beginning to be pulled back, away from them, away from the light. "I love you," I called to them as the distance grew. "I'll take care of James, I promise." "We know," Elizabeth called back. "We love you too." Jesus' voice followed me as I was drawn backward. "Remember, Archie, I am with you always." Then darkness again, but not the same darkness as before. This was the darkness of closed eyelids, of a physical body. I felt pain return, crushing, overwhelming physical pain. I felt something in my throat, heard beeping machines, smelled antiseptic. "We've got a rhythm!" someone shouted. "He's back!" I tried to open my eyes but couldn't. I tried to speak but gagged on the tube in my throat. "Mr. Winslow, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." I felt a hand in mine and summoned all my strength to squeeze it. "He's responding. BP's climbing, heart rate stabilizing." I drifted in and out of consciousness after that. Surgeries, pain medication, fragments of conversations between medical staff. But through it all, one thought remained crystal clear. James needed me, and I had promised to be there for him. When I finally regained full consciousness 3 days later, they told me I'd been dead for 10 minutes and 15 seconds before they managed to restart my heart. They called it a miracle that I had no brain damage despite the extended period without oxygen. I knew it was more than luck or medical skill that had brought me back. I had been sent back. I had a purpose. The first time I saw James after the accident, he was still heavily sedated. Both his legs were in casts, his right arm as well, cracked ribs. Internal bleeding they'd managed to stop. But he was alive. I was in a wheelchair, unable to walk yet with my own injuries. A nurse pushed me to his bedside, and I took his small hand in mine. "I'm here, James," I whispered. "Dad's here, and I'm not going anywhere." The grief would come in waves over the following days, weeks, months. Sometimes it felt like I was drowning in it. The funerals, 3 caskets, one heartbreakingly small, nearly broke me. But each time the guilt and grief threatened to pull me under, I remembered the light, remembered Jesus' words, "My grace is sufficient." It wasn't easy. Nothing about our new reality was easy. James would wake screaming from nightmares. He would ask for his mother, then remember and dissolve into tears I could only hold him through, not stop. We both attended therapy, separately and together. We learned to talk about Elizabeth, about my mother, about baby Anna. We kept their pictures everywhere. We remembered them, we honored them. But slowly, we also learned to live without them physically present. 6 months after the accident, I received a letter. It was from Thomas Miller, the driver of the truck that hit us. He had survived with relatively minor injuries, a cruel irony that had tormented him. His letter was 8 pages of agonized apology. He had fallen asleep after driving all night to make a delivery deadline. His company had been pushing impossible schedules. He had thought he could make it just a few more miles to a rest stop. He had been wrong. I read the letter 7 times. Then I called the number he had included at the end. We met at a small diner halfway between our towns. He looked like a ghost of a man, thin, hollow-eyed, haunted. He couldn't meet my gaze at first. "Mr. Winslow," he began, his voice cracking. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to—" "I forgive you," I interrupted. His head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "I forgive you, Thomas. I know it was an accident. I know you would take it back if you could." Tears filled his eyes. "How can you possibly forgive me?" I killed your wife, your mother, your baby daughter. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pain of loss but no longer accompanied by the crushing weight of guilt. Because holding on to anger and bitterness won't bring them back, I said. And because I've been forgiven for things I couldn't fix either. I don't deserve it, he whispered. None of us deserve forgiveness, I replied. That's what makes it grace. We talked for 3 hours that day. I learned about his 3 children, his 15 years of safe driving before that one fatal moment of unconsciousness. I showed him pictures of Elizabeth, my mother, and Anna. Not to make him feel worse, but to let him see them as people, not just victims. By the end, we were both exhausted, but somehow lighter. Before we parted, I asked if I could pray with him. He nodded, too overcome to speak. We bowed our heads right there in the diner booth, and I prayed for peace, for both of us. That meeting changed something in me. The act of extending forgiveness helped me accept the forgiveness I'd been offered in that place of light. The guilt didn't vanish completely. I suspect it never will entirely this side of heaven, but it no longer defined me. James and I built a new life, different, marked by loss, but also by love, and eventually, by joy again. I kept my promise. I was there for him, for school events, for nightmares, for questions about his mother that would ambush us years after we thought we'd worked through everything. I never told James about my experience until his 18th birthday. I wasn't sure he was ready before then, or maybe I wasn't ready to share it. But when I finally did tell him about those 10 minutes and 15 seconds, about seeing his mother and grandmother in that place of light, about my conversation with Jesus about guilt and forgiveness, he listened with tears streaming down his face. Do you think it was real? He asked when I'd finished. Or just your brain trying to make sense of everything? I thought carefully before answering. I believe it was more real than anything I've experienced before or since, I said finally. And it changed me. Changed how I understand forgiveness. Changed how I understand God's love for us. That's the most powerful evidence I have. Not what I saw, but how it transformed me. He nodded slowly. I wish I could have seen Mom too. You will, I promised him, certain of this truth. Just not yet. It's been 15 years since the accident. James is in college now, studying psychology. He wants to work with children who've experienced trauma and loss. My physical scars have healed, though I still walk with a slight limp. The emotional scars have changed too, no longer raw and bleeding, but tender reminders of those I've loved and lost. I've spoken to hundreds of grief support groups over the years, sharing what I learned about guilt and forgiveness. I never mentioned the near-death experience directly in those settings. That's too personal, too sacred to share widely. But its lessons infuse everything I say. Thomas and I still meet once a year, on the anniversary of the accident. We visit the cemetery together, and he brings flowers for Elizabeth, my mother, and Anna. His oldest daughter is getting married next month. He's asked me to attend. I will. Sometimes at night when the house is quiet, I close my eyes and try to recapture the feeling of that light, that love, that perfect peace. It's like trying to remember a beautiful dream that fades upon waking, but I know it waits for me, for all of us. I am not afraid of death anymore. How could I be, knowing what and who waits on the other side? But I'm not in a hurry to get there either. I have promises to keep, a son to support, a life to live fully. I was dead for 10 minutes and 15 seconds. In that short span of time, that blink of eternity's eye, I learned more about guilt, forgiveness, and God's unfathomable love than in all my years before or since. The truth I discovered is simple but profound. Guilt is a prison we build ourselves, forgiveness is the key that sets us free, and love, God's perfect love, is the reason the door was unlocked in the first place. Elizabeth was right. I was stronger than I knew. Or rather, the strength I needed was always available to me. I just had to be broken enough to accept it. Every morning, I wake up and make a choice, to live this day not in guilt over the past or fear of the future, but in gratitude for the present. To honor those I've lost by embracing the life I still have. To remember that forgiveness, both giving and receiving it, is not a one-time event, but a daily decision. And every night, before I sleep, I whisper the same words. I'll see you soon, in the blink of an eye, because in the light of eternity, that's exactly how long it will be. As I finish writing this account, I'm struck by how inadequate words are to describe what I experienced in those minutes between life and death. How do you explain colors to someone who's never seen? How do you describe music to someone who's never heard? My experience in that place of light was like that, beyond the capacity of language to fully capture. But I share it anyway, imperfect as my telling may be, because the truth I learned there is too important to keep to myself. There is no guilt so great that it cannot be forgiven. There is no loss so deep that it cannot be healed. There is no separation so final that it cannot be overcome. In a world that often feels dark and broken, that's a light worth sharing. My name is Archie Winslow. For 10 minutes and 15 seconds, I was clinically dead. And in those moments, I discovered that death is not the end of the story. It's barely the beginning.